All right, welcome to Level Table Live, Level Legal's monthly legal services live stream that serves up sometimes breaking news, hot tips, and personal stories. I'm Joey Sieber, CEO of Level Legal, and as usual, I'm here with our Director of Client Solutions, Daniel Bonner. Daniel,
Hi,
good to be
Joey.
with you again.
Good to see you.
Missed
Looking
you
forward to
last
it.
month when you were flying solo, but I'm glad to be back.
Looking forward to it.
We're not going to ask how Thanksgiving was because everybody's asking that question. But we're excited to be here today to explore glass half full, Ari Kaplan's optimistic take on the future of legal. Ari Kaplan is our guest today. And by the end of our time, we'll talk about why Ari feels optimistic about legal services. We'll hear some great stories about Ari and two law firm partners who changed his career, ways that legal professionals can prepare for the exciting future of legal services, and we'll talk about core values, skill building, showing adaptability, all those kinds of things. So, welcome to Level Table Live, Ari.
It's a privilege to be here. Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Absolutely, we're glad to have you here.
Good to see you, Ari. So
Yeah,
before
great
we
to see
begin, we're going to cover a couple of housekeeping items. So we are recording this. If you would not wish to appear in any way, please drop now. We like interaction also, so please submit your questions and we'll get them either here or live after the show concludes.
All right, so let's better introduce Ari. So, those of you who are kind of tuning in, you probably know that you probably already know Ari. Um, and for most people, he probably needs no introduction, but I am going to introduce you anyway. And I have to refer to notes, Ari, because you're so accomplished.
So accomplished, Joey.
Yeah, no, I'm being serious. I'm being
Yeah.
serious. So, first of all, many of you may not know that Ari hosts a daily virtual lunch. He's done so since the pandemic, um, and a twice weekly podcast, Reinventing Professionals. Ari also publishes market research reports. It seems like every time I talk to him, he's talked with somebody or many people in the industry doing his research. He has written two books, The Opportunity Maker and Reinventing Professional Services. Zillow co-founder Spencer Rascoff described his second book as an essential guide. So that's a high compliment. Ari's also a ghostwriter. He's a frequent speaker to corporate legal departments, law firms, law schools, legal coaches everywhere. He coaches lawyers on business development and practice strategies. And we are really happy that Ari has been a host for Level Table Live events that we have hosted for many years now, and he does a great job. Ari, welcome. We're glad that you're here.
I am honored. I'm a big fan of both of you, and I'm happy to have this conversation. So thank
Good.
you for inviting me.
Well, let's get started, Ari. I first met you. I think I'm certain it was following one of your presentations at Legal Week. You did such a great job, and you were so optimistic that I thought I need to know this guy better. So I was struck by how positive you were. Where does that come from?
You know what's the alternative, Joey? You're as positive a leader as I've met, and so I would maybe throw the question back to you, but I just I've always kind of led with gratitude and feeling fortunate about what I'm doing. I grew up in Brooklyn. I still have the same friends that I had in high school. Dated a girl once in high school. We went on one date and uh, always just thought she was amazing, and I ended up marrying that girl. So I don't know. I just have I feel like why I think that the optimism maybe comes from the idea that you get to choose, right? You get to choose your outlook, your perspective, and with all of the things, you're sort of a composite of all the things that happen in your life, and you sort of make a choice and try to take advantage of all of those moments in any way that you can. And so I feel fortunate. I've never thought of my career or anything other than an opportunity to be grateful for where I am and, to look ahead.
Right. When it comes to the law, Ari, I know that you have an optimistic take on the law, the practice of law, and you speak to it in a positive way that, frankly, a lot of lawyers and professionals don't. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I think a lot of it comes from mentors that I have had over the years. When I first started practicing, I mean, I always joke with people. I've been fortunate to speak at over 50 law schools around the world,
Oh, wow.
and I often start telling people that I was a terrible law student. Just sort of always to disarm the audience. They think, oh, they're bringing in this person, and he's going to tell us all these things, and it will be hard to achieve. And I always start with, I was a terrible law student, to be perfectly honest. And in my first job interview, the partner who interviewed me told me that I had, more C's on my transcript than anyone that he had ever interviewed in the history of the law firm. And I thought about it for a second and I said, some of those were C pluses. And that was kind of the,
There's the optimism.
it worked out really well. But the point of that story is that the individual that interviewed me was an alumni of my law school, and I had networked my way into a conversation with a partner of his in another city, and asked that partner if he would consider sending my resume to the New York office, and he did. And I assumed, and I got a letter that said something like, we have your resume on file. We don't have any openings. And I assumed that meant,
Yeah.
we crumpled up your resume and threw it in the garbage.
Right.
But several months later, when there was an opening, they called me, and I was lucky to take advantage of that opportunity. And in fact, even when the senior partner, different from the group, but a different partner who was also part of the decision-making process, said, I see on your resume it says top 75%, which is just a number that I made up. I assume I was in the bottom of the class somewhere, so I just wrote top 75%. And the partner was like, "Does that mean top quarter?" And I was like, "No." And I'm just like totally deadpan. I was just like, "No." And he's like, I think you just appreciated the audacity that someone would write, I'm in the top 75%, as if that meant anything. I think
That's
there was like a
awesome.
requirement that you had to write that. So I wrote that, and I ended up getting that job. And it was a great job. It was a great experience, and it was exactly the kind of work that I wanted to do at the time.
Top 75%. That's a first.
There you go, Joey.
Right.
This
I'm gonna
is
use
always
that.
something you don't know about me, but
And
that was.
you write for a living.
Well, my mother used to always say that to me. I didn't get onto law review when I was in law school, and my mother was always so surprised. She was my mother. She's my mother, and I ended up, as a result, it was a very interesting sort of series of events. But I was friendly with the editor in chief of the law school's newspaper. Our law school had a newspaper, and the editor in chief, I was writing some articles like professor had a baby, and I profiled him and wrote it. It wasn't like high journalism. And the editor in chief said, Ari, would you consider being the managing editor during the third year for the newspaper? And I thought, managing editor, is there no one? It turned out nobody else wanted to do that job. And the managing editor, it turns out, didn't actually read anything or edit anything. The managing editor laid it out in PageMaker.
Oh, yeah.
And also, it included, you got paid for your time, and it included like a pretty significant scholarship, like a grant toward your tuition. So I immediately took that position, but I had this sort of managing editor on my
Right.
resume, and that helped me in the job process. And my mom would always be like, look at those people, they didn't take you onto law. I'm 50 years old. My mother still reminds me that I didn't get it to law review, but that I'm a writer. And I'm always
Yes.
like, you're
A
right,
managing
Mom.
editor.
She's like, do you show them your book? I'm like, I don't show anybody anything, Ma. Those people are, they're like my peers now. There's no, group of people that didn't choose me. And so,
Right.
yes, I'm a writer now, and I love it.
That's great.
That's awesome. So Ari, you do a lot of market research, something I'm looking forward to reviewing your piece for next year. But this is making you even more optimistic about legal services. What have you been hearing?
Daniel, this started. So I practiced law. Just so folks know, I practiced law for nearly 9 years. I graduated law school in 1997. I started practicing in 97 in New York City and practiced with large firms there until middle of 2006 when I left the law to become a writer. And everybody, I'm telling you, everybody thought this was a stupid idea except for my wife. And to her credit, she really, thought you do what you think is the best for you, which will turn out to be the best for us, and it'll be great. And she was, absolutely correct. And I feel just fortunate that she encouraged me in that way. But and then I started ghostwriting at that time. Someone actually approached me. I'd been freelancing. I probably wrote 125 articles during the period that I practiced, and which was amazing, which is something I highly recommend. But at some point, I got a real taste for it and started pitching. And I practiced during the early years, which during the sort of the internet heyday when magazines would have hundreds of pages, and there was just a massive amount of advertising from technology companies. And so I wrote for Wired. I had a column for Ziff Davis's eWeek magazine. I had to actually go to Ziff Davis, do a photo shoot to get my headshot taken. It was super exciting and a lot of fun. And then somebody approached me before I stopped practicing and said, would you consider being a ghostwriter? Would you consider writing for us? And I thought, what does that mean? And it turned out it just meant writing a lot of stuff and under somebody else's byline, which was fine with me. And it worked out great. And then somebody asked me if I would consider, it was for a company called Fios, and they said, would you consider, instead of just writing for us, would you consider interviewing a number of corporate counsel and putting their thoughts together into some research, qualitative and quantitative research? And I thought, that's not going to work. Nobody is going to talk to me. And she said, I think it was a woman named Debbie Caldwell, who I'm ever grateful to. And she said, I think they will. And why don't we, I said, let's structure it so that if only two people talk to me, she's like, fine, whatever you want, but I think this is going to work. And to her credit, not everybody I called, but enough people that I reached out to were agreed to speak to me, that it started this sort of wonderful part of my career. At this point, I've written over 50 different reports. And so it's sort of like, Daniel, I know that you're a very handy individual and have stuff and equipment, and we've had conversations about this, but it's like when I was a kid, my dad used to always ask me to hold the flashlight. And that was our thing. My dad was an incredibly
That's a key role.
Yeah, no, it turned out, my dad was an incredibly handy individual. And so he would always ask me to hold the flashlight. Plumbing, electrical, carpentry, whatever it was, I had to hold the flashlight. And at some point, I didn't like doing this anymore. I got older. I was like, he doesn't need a flashlight. Get a light, stick it on the ceiling or something. Why do you need me to stand here and hold this light? He'd be like, no. I need you to go over here. And it had to be very, very, careful and pay attention to what he was doing because the light needed to be shined on that thing. And like years later, I learned he didn't ever need the light, right? He just wanted me to learn what he was doing. And I'm, it's amazing now because now every time, something leaks or there's a wire or something, my wife thinks I'm just going to get in there, and which I have done. I've taken apart my dryer, my refrigerator, and my printer, which is a little hobby of mine. But the point is that I feel like I have this privilege now of holding the flashlight. Right. I'm still holding the flashlight in many ways, trying to shine a light on what's happening in our profession. And when you talk about me being optimistic, it's really because I'm interviewing hundreds of people every year in senior leadership positions, whether they're in law firms or corporate legal departments, whether in the United States, whether they're abroad, really trying to understand, capture those perspectives, getting a realistic view of what's happening, because those people know that they're speaking to me anonymously. Like, I'm not going to reveal who they are. So they're very candid and honest. And I really appreciate that. So yes, I've produced this research and, can't believe how fortunate I am to be able to do that.
Well, sticking with the research a bit longer, we keep hearing that legal professionals are worried about AI. Is that showing up in your research?
I don't know that there's anyone that isn't thinking about what this will do to their future. And I'm always of the mindset that it will have a tremendous impact on your future, just as the internet had, just as outsourcing does, just as more junior people coming in to take the roles of more senior people. This is not a mystery to anyone. Things aren't changing so rapidly. It seems like it's changing rapidly because there's so much more information, and the pace of information is moving so much more quickly. But anybody that's lived for any period of time, any professional that's been active for a number of years, that lived through the, I'm someone who lived through the, just, in in my career, right? The financial crisis, the internet boom and bust,
Mhm.
September 11th, the pandemic. There have been all these different issues, and every single time something comes up, I always think, oh, how can I live the things that I've talked about, right? I mean, wrote two books. One is called The Opportunity Maker, and I'm constantly thinking of ways to create opportunity. And the other is called Reinventing Professional Services. It's all about, how do you adapt? How can you stay nimble? How could you never drink your own Kool-Aid and become so intoxicated on it that you can't move? And I think that, yes, everybody is talking about AI. There's lots of talk about AI. Could you hear that? Did everyone hear the Brooklyn come out just there? The talk.
Talk,
Whenever I
talk
try
is
to
more.
avoid it, but every once in a while, when I get excited, you should hear when my wife and I are having a conversation back and forth. Wow, real Brooklyn comes out. But the point is, there's a lot of discussion about it. I think there's very little certainty about it. There's excitement, there's fear. I think all of those are valid, and I think that people who are feeling concerned or uncomfortable should embrace that feeling and figure out how they can be value centric and move from there. But anybody who thinks they're going to be able to stand still
Right.
is mistaken. And I
Mm.
think that's more of the message that I'm hearing and that I feel that I'm embracing than paralysis or stagnation. Those are the things that are going to be a challenge. But uncertainty, the willingness to adapt is a much more of the mindset that I think is going to help people progress.
That's great perspective.
Interesting. Ari, I want to backtrack a little bit because I'm interested to know a little bit more about your journey. So you were practicing law at a large law firm up until 2006, if I remember right.
That's
And
correct.
I think there were a couple of mentors and experiences that were really important in you kind of making the change and leaving that practice. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. So the very first day I started practicing, so I was fortunate to get a job. I had, in college, spent a semester in London, and I was an intern for uh, the office of a member of parliament, like in their community office. It was in Twickenham. There's a big stadium there that people may know. I think they play football there now. And from the American perspective, they obviously do many things at that stadium. And so then the following summer, so that was the fall, I think fall of 1981. The following summer, I spent a summer teaching English in what was then Czechoslovakia. And then when I graduated, I spent a year teaching English in Japan, in Kobe. And so I had all this wonderful international experience. I was a kid that grew up in Brooklyn. None of us had any passports. We never went anywhere. I went to Florida once or twice, but I never went anywhere. And I always had this like dream of traveling and seeing the world a little bit. And I was lucky to do that. And so I went to law school, and then I was fortunate my second summer to get a job working at the State Department, and I worked for the chief legal counsel in the Office of Foreign Missions. And it was a very, I'll share this only because I feel like for people who feel like this process is so competitive and difficult from a law school standpoint, I as I mentioned, I was not a great law student. And so I knew that any of these opportunities that come out of going to law school were not open to me at that moment. I didn't think they were never going to be open to me. And in fact, I was correct that they eventually opened up to me, but they were not open at that time. And so I wasn't sure if I was going to go back to law school. And I took this long walk before my second year started. And I just said to I made a deal with myself essentially that I would go back if I were able and applied and really set my mind to getting an internship in one of four places, because I went to GW Law School, so I was in Washington D.C. I wanted to work at the CIA, the FBI, the State Department, or the United Nations. That was sort of my goal. I knew that I wouldn't get paid, but I felt like those were awesome places, and if I didn't get paid, it'd still be amazing experience. And I set out to do that, and I applied for these jobs. And so I get a call from someone at the United Nations saying, we'd like to meet you for an internship. And then I get a call from someone at the State Department who said, I know the person at the United Nations or something like that, and I would like you to come in and have an interview. And I said, the United Nations is in New York. I live in New York. It's easier. I can't stay in Washington, D.C. and be an intern. And he said, no, this is for a paid position. And I was
Wow.
basically like, why? Like, why? And the guy
Why
was like,
me?
it was very funny that he said, he's like, you've worked in Japan and the Czech Republic, you had worked in the UK, you have a real experience that would be valuable in our office. Why would you? He's like, just if for the future, you shouldn't ask, why would you even want to meet me to someone that wants to meet you for a job? And I thought, well, point noted. And so anyway, I got this job at the State Department, and that led to this job when I started practicing doing international trade. And the partner that I worked for was an incredibly gifted lawyer and was one of the founding partners of this boutique firm that only focused on customs and international trade.
Mm.
And that was my first job. And when I sat down the first day, again, he was an alumni of my law school. He said, Ari, I write a column for this newspaper, which means we write a column for this newspaper.
Right.
And to his credit, every single column we wrote together had both of our names on it. Like it was a double byline. And so by the time I was a second year associate, I probably had published like 10 articles. I mean, they were
Mm.
on obscure topics like the importation of Chinese wood. But it was great. And in my first year, I was very involved in preparing a brief for a major retailer, for the general counsel of a major retailer on the banana war. There was a trade war that was happening, and our client was very involved. It was very affected by this, kind of change. And so I had to actually cancel a vacation to spend the weekend working on this brief, but side by side with this amazing general counsel. And it was great work. So he was instrumental because he got me started in realizing
Mm.
that writing was very powerful. And then what he did was he taught me a very important lesson, which I think is critical, is that he taught me how to use writing as a vehicle to meet people. And so he had wanted to get connected to someone in the government. Like there was someone who took on a new position in the government and wanted to meet that person because it felt like it would be really important for the practice. And he was correct and called that office and said, you know what? We were sitting there working on an idea for our next column. And he said, sit here. I'm going to call their office. And I was like, you're just going to randomly call and say you want to speak to that person? And he said, yes, watch. And he sat there and he said, hi, I'm so-and-so. And, I'm a partner at this firm. And I write a column for a trade publication in our industry, and I would love to feature the new so and so in our next column. His vision for the role, what he thinks is going to happen, how things will, transpire over the next. And sure enough, the person said, "Sure, I'm happy to meet." He said, "We'll fly down." My boss thought it was important enough that we would fly down to Washington to have this
Mm.
in-person meeting because he wanted to have the meeting. The writing was the vehicle to get the meeting, but he knew that the
Right.
meeting, the face to face, was of super value. And so over time, that really stuck with me. So it was pivotal in my life. And in fact, at some point, maybe a year and a half later, it was 1988, something like that. And I said, I've been reading a lot about this internet, and I think that's something.
I
And I
think
said,
it's a
I would love
thing.
right. I was like,
You were
I was
right,
like,
Ari.
wasn't I, Joey? I was like,
Prophetic.
shouldn't I was like, why don't we start writing about the internet? And he was like, between our column and this other stuff, it's very, if you think you can bill your time and work with me on the column, you could do whatever you want. And he really gave me that wonderful freedom. And I ended up just, I'd write articles in the middle of the night, whatever it took, but I'd get to meet tech
Mm.
leaders and other experts. And so he was one. Sorry for the long story, but he was one. And then the other was a partner who's still a partner at McDermott Will and Emery, where I was incredibly lucky to spend 6 years. Her name is Lisa Linsky, and she was my mentor. In fact, I left that firm in 2006, and she's still my mentor. Like I'm having breakfast
Oh,
with her
wow.
next week. Like she's the most wonderful human being and so generous in terms of the development of the people around her that I don't even, it's indescribable. It's like the perfect example of what a law firm partner should be. But I remember we were working on some commercial litigation, and every time I felt like I had achieved what I'd have to review some documents and I became very adept at that, or I had to write some things and I became very adept at that. And I always say, I'm not really sure. I feel like I'd like to take a deposition. And she's like, next deposition is yours. And every time
Wow.
she'd always say, I'd say, I feel like I'd like to argue a motion in court. She's like, great. What's the next motion? It's yours. You argue it. I'm like, it's an important motion. She's like, I have complete trust in you. I'll be there, but I have complete, and although I have to say that my wife came to watch me argue that first motion, and my wife is like a gifted litigator. Even at the time when we were younger, she was gifted beyond her years. And I remember afterward, I can't remember I lost or won. I think I had to get a court reporter, and I speak quickly, and I certainly speak quickly, when I'm arguing and nervous in court. Then, and after I left, I was walking with my wife, and she's like, "You spoke too fast," and she gave me like this whole list of things of how to be a better lawyer, and it was very funny. And I was like, I don't know how many of those I'm going to do, but thank you. But anyway, Lisa,
Yeah.
my mentor, was always very generous in giving me more responsibility than I could have imagined myself having,
Mm.
and always believed in me in a way that I couldn't imagine myself believing into. And even to this day, she reminds me of things and encourages me in ways that I think you as a leader, Joey, I know
Yeah.
you and I'm lucky to know you. I think you do the same.
Mm.
And, in the career of many of the folks who I know on your team. And I think that's a real testament to leadership. But she really, has been a wonderful mentor to me and continues to this day to be
Yeah.
that kind of mentor.
It's important. It's important to remember and to thank those mentors that we have along the way, isn't it? Ari, along the way, you mentioned ghostwriting. So, where in this journey of this mentorship and then this writing, where did the ghostwriting come in?
When I made this decision. I've been practicing law for nearly 9 years. I was with a very large firm. I always felt like I was incredibly well compensated. I think that lawyers forget that. It's not always an easy job. And so there's this impression that you should be paid that amount of money, but I feel like that's a very twisted reality that we live in
Mm.
in a Western society. That all of it just it just always seemed like a lot of money. I mean, I guess Lisa always would remind me that I come from this place of abundance. Like I'm just always feeling like, wow, that's amazing. Especially because I practiced during the years where the firms were constantly battling over salaries.
Yeah.
And so, you'd get in May, they decide, oh, we've raised their salaries because of the internet boom or something, and we've retroactively paid you from January. And I'd go home and I'd feel like I got a raise and they're going to give me a check from
Just
January.
showed up.
We
Money
would
just
just,
showed up.
we'd be like, wow. So, I think that the ghostwriting part of it. So I left to become a writer and realized that, I might be able to create some kind of a business as a subject matter expert in legal tech. Because what happened was, over the years, I was writing about technology. So I was writing about, you know, legal technology in the sense of domain name disputes or privacy implications of using the internet. I was interviewed on CNN at once by Carol Costello as part of the digital downloading, kind of the Napster era.
Mm. Yeah.
And I'll tell people that that was the result of me writing a book review of a prominent individual who could not appear on that segment of CNN, and suggested that she call me. I had been doing so. This also may be a message to people who are listening, particularly the junior people. So I had heard it's very important to have people in the profession that you emulate. And so I had identified certain people who I felt like were super cool and interesting and had developed a practice and an expertise. And so I would watch them and like pay attention to their content at a time where there wasn't LinkedIn, it wasn't as easily accessible. And so this individual I noticed had been doing these interviews on CNET. CNET had a radio station at the time, and it had
Mm.
actually like a drive time, rush hour station on technology. And I remember calling them I was a very junior associate. I really had no business calling them about this. And I said, "Hi, I'm Ari Kaplan, and I write about technology and legal issues, and I could really, I'd be happy to be one of your experts." And the guy's like, "We have an like, who are you?" And I was like, "I'm Ari Kaplan. Now there's a sign at least, but it was nothing." And so, he, and I thought, you know what? I'm gonna keep trying, and because he'd be like, "No, thank you, no, thank you," and I was like, this other guy's got to maybe have a sick day, go on vacation, have a court. I don't know. There's got to be a reason. And so there was this moment where I don't remember. It was like a holiday, and I was working, or it was over the holidays or something, and I was working, trying to bill my time before the end of the year, which I'm guessing some people, if anyone's listening, some people can relate to,
Yeah.
and they called me, and they're like, "Ari, this is so and so." Like he was totally defeated in calling me
Right.
because he was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm calling this kid," and he's like, "We have an issue in Australia. There was a case. Do you think you could speak to it?" I was like, "I could definitely speak to it. I'm ready."
I'm an expert.
And so I had all these like sort of Forrest Gump moments. I ended up doing like a dozen of those interviews on CNET Radio,
Oh, wow.
and sometimes my firm didn't know what to do with me. They were like, Why are they talking to you?" I was like, I reached
I'm
out,
an expert.
and eventually, so I had done the CNN thing, and it was a very funny moment because my friend was
That's
the
great.
gym, and she's like, "I saw you on CNN this morning," and I was like, I know, my life is like that.
Yeah.
It didn't change anything, to be honest. It did nothing change at all. But I was like, I was on CNN this morning. Pretty
Ari,
neat.
you've had quite a journey,
Mhm.
including a career change. Is there advice that you would give to lawyers who are thinking about a career change?
There's been some discussion. I've seen some discussion on LinkedIn about this, and we live in an era now where there are lots of opportunities for lawyers to and legal professionals to repurpose themselves into another kind of role. It's actually amazing. When I was practicing, there wasn't that much you could do. You were a lawyer, you could be a paralegal. At the time, there weren't even sort of contract attorney roles or other roles within. Now, firms have so many non-partnership track kind of roles that really didn't exist. Now you can be head of knowledge management, you can be an innovation lawyer, you can take your e-discovery skills and turn them into legal operations. I mean, there were just so many wonderful pathways. I would encourage lawyers, though, to try to figure out what they need and if they're capable of sacrificing those needs for an increased level of satisfaction. And I think that's, my daughter, we were talking about, I forgot what we were talking about, but I said, how you have more than you need? And she's
Mm,
like, earn more money. And I was like, no, just need less. And I'm not sure she quite got it, but I feel like especially at the highest levels of practice in terms of the status of the work or the money, you would tend to associate with that. And if you're not at sort of that peak level, there are all kinds of issues that are associated with it. But today it's the profession is really amazing because there are
yeah.
all these wonderful opportunities in legal tech, in legal services, both here and outside the United States. There are so many different kinds of roles in law firms. The business of law has become so important that professionals who have some legal experience, but an acumen in management and other areas can really thrive. But I would just say if you're thinking of making a change, realistic about what that change is and
Mm,
be open and be willing to gain additional kind of understanding and education and insights into what will make you a more holistic kind of professional.
right. That's great advice. Thank you for that. I think we have a question. Do we have
Wow.
a question? Yeah. Ari,
Yeah.
you are looking well. Okay. Well, it's a comment. So here's the question. With Microsoft's introduction of Copilot, do you expect Microsoft will continue to invest in e-discovery and data governance at the same pace as the last 5 years? You've just told us that you're an expert, Ari, so here's your expert question.
Am I an expert? Well, I just want to also highlight, David, comment about dessert before dinner because I have this thing where I'll eat dessert. We'll be at a table at a reception or something. I'll always, there's always dessert, and I'll have the dessert first. And I'll always
I
think,
I
life,
love that.
life is short. Life is short,
Right.
so you might as well enjoy the sweetness,
Right.
right away. Look, I think Microsoft's introduction of Copilot is a very exciting development, and I think that Microsoft has been investing in e-discovery, as David knows, and as you gentlemen know, in various ways over the years, and will probably start figuring it out. I think that's been a challenge. I think there's been a little bit of a disconnect, and everybody has wondered, why isn't Microsoft deeper in some of the tools? And Microsoft at this point in 365 has a lot of the data. So how is it not developed a more holistic
Hmm.
ecosystem and platform, given the fact that a lot of it takes place within its environment? So my sense is that yes, but I don't know. To David's point, I don't necessarily know if it will be e-discovery specific, or the fact that information management, information governance will become such a core part of what Copilot is asked to do, that it will just be a natural progression. And so e-discovery will just be a ancillary beneficiary of all of the
Hmm.
investment that it's making.
Good. Thank you. Um, Quick question for you. And that is one of the reasons we really enjoy working with you, as you know, is we like to talk about this concept of making legal human. I know that you and your life like to give back. I remember a project that you had with your daughter, I think, or maybe every year you're collecting cans and some huge amount. But do you think that thankfulness is um, maybe a secret sauce or a key to your success? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but could you speak a little bit about giving back?
Yeah, thanks for acknowledging that, Joey. I have always felt the need to be grateful, but also to demonstrate what I'm saying. I'd rather walk the talk. And so in everything I do, I believe that I'm walking the talk when I'm, kind of engaging with folks. And so you mentioned this project. It's called the One Can a Week program. And my daughter and I had done it. She's now in college, so we don't have the same, ability to do it. But when she was 6, my son was always in school on Sunday mornings. And so one Sunday morning, I said to her, I asked some of our neighbors. I saw an article about an individual in Tucson, Arizona, who started this program. He called it One Can a Week, and he asked his neighbors to leave a can of food on their front steps. And so I reached out to some of my neighbors. I said, "Listen, I'm thinking of doing this. Would you consider leaving a can of food?" And they said, "Sure." And so I said to my daughter, "Hey, we're just sitting around watching cartoons or something. You want to walk with me around the neighborhood? A little 6-year-old. Do you want to walk with me around the neighborhood? I think that some people left us some cans of food, and we'll see what we'll see." It's just like a 1-day thing. And so my daughter, to her credit, was so adorable. She got her, her Met cap, and she ran upstairs and she got a notebook and a pencil. I don't know what possessed her to grab a notebook and a pencil, but we went outside and we went to several homes, and there were cans, and it was super exciting to her, and it was very exciting to me. And so I said, "You know what? Why don't you take an inventory of what we're doing?"
Mm,
So she'd practice. She'd be like soup and vegetables and green beans and whatever. And it was amazing. I loved it. And so every week we would try to, I said, "Oh, Hannah and I were there today. I'd love for you to, well, let's continue it." And the neighbors, it turns out, liked doing it because they felt like this is such an easy way for us to be
yeah.
uh, charitable, and you do all the hard work. You come and pick it up, and we happen to live in a neighborhood where it's hilly and whatever. So it was good exercise, and not that either of us needed it, but it was good exercise. And so we continued to do that for 10 or 11 or 12 years. And eventually we would deliver it to a food bank here or a church there, somewhere local. But then at some point, I wanted to take my daughter to like an actual shelter where there was a food pantry so that
Hmm.
she could be in that environment just to see it. Just also, it's a nice drive, and we would drive to a neighborhood that wasn't as great, and we would then carry the cans. We'd always count them. There was a lot of that education
Yeah.
that I didn't intend, but like this sort of like odd level of education. And so we'd count cans, and we'd try to beat our number from last time, and I actually miss it a lot because it was just,
Yeah.
at some point we just started driving, and she had to have games, and it would be harder. But she would start to, they'd have a basketball event. Let's say she was a great basketball player in high school, and they'd have a basketball event. So I'd say, oh, maybe you can get. So she'd ask all the kids to bring a can of food, and then we would put that into our collection and then bring it. Or neighbors starting to hear about it, and they'd host things, and they'd say, oh, can we drop
Mm.
off 4 or 5, crates of food? And I'd be like, great, we'll bring it. And we went to a preschool once, and they had collected all this food and all these cans of food. And my daughter was, I don't know what she was at the time, 8 or 9. And she's sitting in front of a preschool class telling them about this can collection. It was wonderful, but it's philosophically, it's very consistent with my perspective on chipping away. So we have this saying in my house, the hashtag chipping away, like just I'm a big fan of James Clear and Atomic Habits, and he talks about this principle of 1% better, and which is a very accessible concept. And so the 1 can a week is just like that. It's just sort of a single can of food is not really a big deal, but a single can of food times 52 weeks a year times, let's say, 10 homes times 10 years, and all of a sudden it's a massive amount of food. And also gave my daughter an understanding of food insecurity. And she's even now that she's in college, she's written several essays about food insecurity. She's done more research on it. And I just feel like things like that are important. And we do that a lot with other charitable giving. We'll automate it so that every month it'll be automated. And I went somewhere once to like a board meeting for one of these charities. I happened to be in the city, and they introduced me to the board, and someone said, this is Ari Kaplan. He and his wife have actually made a monthly donation every month for the last 19 years or something. And the whole board was like, stood up and started like clapping. Not that it was $1 million. It was just that it was so consistent that over 19 years, anything. So if you do that with your career, if you do that with, just sort of your relationships, it there's no way that it doesn't have an impact. And frankly, often it's just positive. It's just like you've paid into the well of credibility. And I think that's a big part of that.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Ari. Thank you for sharing that. Daniel.
Well, Ari, this is the time in the show where we shift gears. We're going to move into some rapid fire questions, if that's all right.
Okay.
Starting first. So what was the hardest thing about leaving the practice of law in the law firm?
The hardest thing was realizing that the direct deposit stops. I remember it sounds silly, but you work for a long time. There's always a direct deposit, and then one day you wake up and you're like, wait, how do I replicate that? And I think that people don't necessarily take that into consideration. I actually had a conversation with one of my dearest friends, and I said, how do I make this work? And he's like, well, let's see, how much do you need to make, and how do you backtrack into that? And I have to say, even though that was the hardest, it was the best, because it's super empowering now. I've been on my own, Daniel, for over 17 years. So I've generated my own resources for 17 years. So every time there's some kind of the financial crisis happened or the pandemic or whatever, I've always been like, well, it's just on me. So if I was earning 10 from someone, and now I have to earn, they can only, I have to now break that into ones, 10 times 1 or 5 times 2 or whatever it is. I'll just figure that out and try to apply the principles from the Opportunity Maker or Reinventing Professional Services to try to break it down into the chipping away different components, 1% better. Like I really feel, I do this with my running, with my other pursuits. Like I just feel like just chip away at it and it'll be fine.
That's a great reminder. I love the chipping away. So next question, what qualities do leaders need these days? I know times have changed, and you talked about adapting earlier, so I'm curious about that.
Joey mentioned at the outset that I have been hosting a virtual lunch every single weekday at noon Eastern. Actually, today was episode number 919. Level Legal was a sponsor
Unbelievable.
generously in 2021 in the early days, and I've had a lot of leaders on. In fact, I was thinking today about our discussion and optimism, and I interviewed Joey for my podcast in the spring of 2020, I think it was, about leadership. And he himself was very optimistic and sort of expressed this optimism in business and how business would rise again, and we would see success, and we'd have to overcome this as a collaborative community. And that podcast discussion ended up getting published in a transcript form in the ABA Journal, and lots of people got benefit from it. And so, I think that Daniel, leaders really need to be mindful of what their teams are experiencing, but also I think there has we have kind of developed a reality that there needs to be some sort of balance between personal success, business success, that it's really a much more of a finding this equilibrium between how you live and what you do, and
Mm.
leaders who acknowledge that and allow people to be in situations where their highest and best skills are applied to the kinds of activities that are most important to the organization. So I feel like in many organizations, there's a misalignment sometimes between what people are very good at, where they can thrive, where they can succeed, and what the organization needs. And so what happens is you become dissatisfied because you're actually doing something that isn't really aligned with what your skill set is. So it's harder for you. It becomes more of a grind. But if a leader can be part of the conversation to help figure out, look, this person is exceptionally good at this, and we need someone with that skill set here, then take them out of working there and put them there, and just try to realign it. So it's in many ways it's like a little bit of a game, and the leaders really need to have a holistic view of what the pieces are and where the needs are, where the demand is, and give people the chance to thrive, but also give them a chance to grow.
Yeah.
And organizations that empower growth, again, I worked with Lisa, and she always found that. She always figured out a way to help me grow, both as a person. It's funny, she was at my son's bris. She, like, we were very close, and I think that she was at my son's bar mitzvah. I hope, God willing, she'll be at my son's wedding. Like, I think that, and my daughter, but I think that it's really important to develop that connection to both understand where people can thrive and empower them so that they can get to a point where they feel like this is, the ideal role for them.
That's a great reminder. I think a lot of leaders defensively, or excuse me, default to being defensive, of the brand of the organization at times. And so it's really neat to hear your story about your mentor and the encouragement and empowerment that she gave. Appreciate that. So,
Yeah.
Ari, we've had a lot of fun over the years doing various events and dinners together. So we've talked a little bit earlier about the Level Table Dinner Series, and these were amazing. We travel around the country and meet exceptional attorneys and have a great meal. So with the series of dinners we've done together, I was curious what your favorite memory may be from that time.
So I have we always do this exercise, as you both know, about what makes you interesting. This is an activity that came up. I do a lot of speaking about business development and about marketing, and the last person I interviewed for my first book, The Opportunity Maker, was in-house counsel at a big media company, and he said, Ari, the secret is to be interesting, because when you're interesting, you're memorable, and when you're memorable, opportunity follows. And I never really understood what this meant. To be interesting is interesting. It's like the last guy I interviewed is Yogi Berra. It's a very cryptic kind of message, but over time, I've come to learn, and I always ask audiences this question, what makes you interesting? Turn to your neighbor and tell them what makes you interesting. But I love hearing these stories, and it fascinates me how endlessly interesting our profession can be. That Joey has coached Patrick Mahomes, or that one of your other colleagues who I was a huge fan of, Lee Vickery, could write upside down. Like, I remember all of these wonderful things about people, and I just think that gives you great insight, and it immediately warms people to one another. It immediately allows them to relate, and so I think that's a really important part of our community. The kind of the things that bind us are so much stronger than anything that might separate us. And I think, frankly, that's just an important component of community, and finding some, I don't know, some way to connect the world a little bit. Not to get too broad on this, but I just think that the understanding of how closely aligned we are, but for shades of gray, is powerful, and I think it makes those dinners so rich and fun.
That they are. Be interesting, be memorable. I like that. So, Ari, you've had a lot of roles in the industry over the years, and I know you've seen a lot of interesting things. What's the strangest thing you've ever seen?
What a great question, Daniel. What is the strangest thing that I have ever seen? You know what I will say? I think that what is so strange is how many people in the legal industry are willing to get up at 6 or 6:30 in the morning to go running. And the reason I say this is because had a dear friend. His name was Alex Hannon, and he passed away from lung cancer a number of years ago. Young, dynamic, vibrant individual, never smoked, and all of us were crushed. But he was a runner, and so years ago, I had reached out. I was attending Relativity Fest, and I spoke to the group of people I was talking to about my session. And I said, "Hey, is anybody on the call interested in running? I'm a runner." And they said, "It's Chicago in late fall. No, nobody wants." They started laughing. They just started laughing. They were like, "No, I don't. Nobody's going to run with you." And I thought, all right, that's kind of fine. And in fact, that event used to take place the day after the Chicago Marathon, so it was even more ironic that no one would even think of running. And so I said, "Well, would you consider putting something on the agenda, saying, 'Hey, Ari Kaplan is going to run at 6:30 in the morning on Tuesday or something?'" And I come down at 6:30 morning Tuesday, and there are like 30 people on the stairs of this lobby and I thought, wow, I can't believe this. And I've since done that at pretty much every kind of legal conference I attend, and more
Rise
and
and
more
run, right?
people, yeah, the rise and run, and more people show up. And I always make a donation to the Lung Cancer Foundation of America in honor of my friend Alex. And I always say his name. I always tell people about him. And there's something wonderful about that, about all these people knowing about Alex and running in his memory and thinking about it. But also, it's just a great community builder. And I always see LinkedIn notes. People say that was the best part of the day, and it was just a great way to get up. And now I have like people who will join me. I'll see them. The only problem, Daniel, is I feel like people think I'm just a running instructor. I don't think they know what I do anymore. They're just like, "Are you going to run?" And I'm like, "You're still running?" And I'm just like, David wrote, "Oh, you're still eating dessert before dinner?" And I'm like, what have I done to myself? But yeah, I think that's the strangest thing is just all these people. And people always joke. I'll say that the one joke that I find recurring is I'll see somebody and they'll say, "Oh, Ari, I'm sorry I missed your run today." And I'll say, the run it's tomorrow. So, they're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I missed your run tomorrow." It's like, they're trying to be courteous, but they're not coming. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
They're not coming either way.
That's awesome. All right. Next question. So I know you've done a lot of interesting things, noteworthy things, and you've left your fingerprints all over the industry. And so I'm curious what you may be most proud about in terms of the work you've done so far.
What a great question, Daniel. Another great question. Honestly, I'm proud of sparking conversation. I think it's really important. been lucky to, as I mentioned, to speak at many law schools across the country, and I'm still in touch with a lot of those law students. In fact, every once in a while, there'll be a law student who's now the general counsel of a company who I'll speak to for my research. I think there's been a student who may have attended one of our dinners, and I love that. And I feel like that is very powerful because it sort of encouraging a generation of professionals to embrace what it is, to identify all of the wonderful opportunities that it offers, but also where there's potential for change. And so professionally, I'm proud of that. I have to say personally, right? I have two children. They're in college. I'm super proud of them. I'm there. We have this. I always have this hashtag biggest fan, and I'm biggest fan of both of them. I think they're great people, and I know that the three of us have talked about this before, but you know, I couldn't be prouder of the two of them. So I feel like personally and professionally, um, yeah, I think that there's a lot to be proud of there.
Appreciate you sharing that. So what's next for you, Ari?
Wow, what is next? Sometimes I kind of wonder sometimes about this because I'm satisfied. Like I've always thought people always talk about parenting or whatever, and I always say that I have tried to teach my children the capacity to be happy, right? The capacity to be satisfied. And I think people struggle with that. And whatever happens is on them. Life does what life does, and they make things happen. They create opportunities for themselves. But if I can somehow teach the capacity to be happy, to find satisfaction in things, small things. And so sometimes I sort of, struggle with this in some ways. Like I'm satisfied. You can tell. Like I'm happy to be doing what I'm doing. I feel fortunate to be doing it. I use those words, but like if I had to say what's next, I'd love to be right. I'm kind of in the process, but writing another book. I think that there are some ways that I could maybe, I've developed a wonderful network in this space. I'd love to work on some things that connect some of the work that I'm doing, and to continue to learn, to continue to be. I'm always trying to be sort of part of my community. So like I'm in some ways offering ideas and guidance, but at the same time, I want to be embracing the challenges and sort of navigating on the same road as the people I'm talking to, because it makes me better understand what their challenges are. And so I'll continue to do that as best I can.
Awesome. Appreciate you sharing that. And thanks for walking through those with me.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for Glass Half Full. I think you can see after hearing from Ari why that was the title. We got to hear from Ari about why he's optimistic about legal services, great career advice, some good stories about wonderful things he's doing. So, Ari, if people want to find you, how do they find you?
I can be reached via my website, kaplanadvisors.com. You can email me, Ari at arikaplanadvisors.com. I host the virtual lunch every weekday, generally at noon Eastern on Zoom. That link is widely available, but you can go to avirtuallunch.com to find out more information. And lots of my information is widely available, but I really appreciate this chance. I'm a fan of you both, and honored to be associated with your program. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Ari. This has been a pleasure. We appreciate you taking time to be with us. So, if we didn't get to your question here, we'll answer offline. For more information, like Ari, we also have a website, levellegal.com. You can reach us there. Our next Level Table Live will be at noon Central on Tuesday, November 28th. No, that's today. Our next one will be next month. I'm reading an old script. So keep an eye out for registration because today is November 28th. If you have any questions, please reach out to us again. Thank you, Ari, and thank you all for joining us.
Good to see you, Ari. Appreciate you.
Great to see you. Thank you.
All right. Bye.